I eto tako da se je desilo da su mnogi ljudi stradali, mnogi mladi ljudi I djeca su stradali u tome.
Many people suffered and were devastated by this war, which was for me, and for many of us, incomprehensible. You just couldn't believe that your friend, who would knock at your door at 2 a.m. and you'd welcome with a drink, could just come and take you off to a concentration camp and torture you and kill your husband, your brother, and your son.
Da ubijete muža, brata, sina I tako.
In 1992, when Prijedor was occupied, my parents were forced out of their home and expelled from Kozarac. Their house was burned down. My brother was sent to a concentration camp, and his house was also burned. My husband was taken to the Omarska concentration camp, where they tortured him. After 7 days, he was taken out of Omarska, and there has been no trace of him since then. For 10 years now, we have been looking for him, and we have found nothing.
Bila sam zatočena sa ne znam koliko hiljada, je bilo jako.
I was imprisoned with thousands of people. There were a lot of men, mostly Bosnian Muslims and some Croatians.
Bila potpuno ista, naravno Hrvati su manje stradali ili ih je manje u ukupnoj populaciji. Ali uglavnom, a bilo nas je 36 žena.
They were 36 of us women. Horrible torture took place on a daily basis. People were exhausted from starvation. Every day we began with the counting of our dead. I witnessed horrifying tortures of my friends and neighbors.
Imala sam priliku vidjeti stravična mučenja nad mojim prijateljima, sugrađanima, rođacima.
Teške su mi I slike iz tog perioda.
The memories from that period are hard for me. My colleagues forced out of our workplace. Trucks full of refugees from Sanski most passing through.
Iz Sanskog mosta, jer se to nešto prije dešavalo u Sanskom mostu nego u Prijedoru. I kad sam o tom slušala od drugih ljudi, ali ništa nisam činila.
I didn't do anything. That is where my guilt stems from, for all that I did not do.
Osjetila sam jednostavno ne mržnju, nego sam shvatila da
I felt such disappointment, distrust, and betrayal of friendship. I said to myself that I would never in my life speak to another Serb again.
Govoriti mi će kad kročiti prag moje kuće, ako ikada budem imala.
Eliminating the scourge of war is perhaps the most momentous and challenging task facing humanity. Around the globe, seemingly endless cycles of violence unfold, with each new act of revenge calling forth yet another violent response. In the last 20 years, over 6 million people, mostly civilians, have been killed in what amounts to a worldwide epidemic of ethnic, religious, and civil wars. Those who survive are often displaced or disabled, their families scattered, and their communities destroyed. The Karuna Center for Peacebuilding, a nonprofit organization based in Amherst, Massachusetts, was founded in 1993 by Dr. Paula Green to aid societies around the world in their efforts to stop the downward spiral of violence and to heal from the wounds of war. Invited by local leaders seeking to rebuild and reunite their devastated communities in the aftermath of violent conflict, The Karuna Center leads seminars that restore trust, deepen understanding, and develop effective ways to respond to conflicts without violence. The organization draws its name, Karuna, from the ancient Sanskrit word for compassion.
Unhealed wounds and unhealed relationships between ethnic groups recycle themselves and result in revenge. And what we're trying to do ultimately as peace builders is to create peace. And creating peace means trying to interrupt the cycles of violence and revenge and hatred and intolerance that seem to haunt the human condition.
Community leaders from opposing sides of a conflict participate in structured dialogues and learn peace-building skills in programs run by the Karuna Center in collaboration with local organizations. Workshops address the root causes of conflict and explore methods for interrupting cycles of revenge. These settings provide a safe environment for participants to share the many ways their lives have been affected by violence and war. Each series of workshops is tailored to the specific history and cultural traditions of the region and includes the training of facilitators who will continue the work into the future.
We teach the skills of peace and nonviolent conflict resolution and dialogue where people explore the differences, the intolerance, the prejudice they've grown up with, the cycles of revenge that have existed in their communities, and attempt to find ways together to build a joint future.
Karuna Center's most extensive training project to date took place in Bosnia, following the civil war that erupted after the breakup of the former Yugoslavia in the early 1990s. 3 years of war resulted in 250,000 deaths, 2 million refugees, and the destruction of a vibrant, multi-ethnic, highly educated, and prosperous society. It was during this war that the term ethnic cleansing entered the world's vocabulary.
In 1996, the phone rang one day, and there was a Bosnian woman named Emsuda who was calling me from a city in northern Bosnia named Sanski Most. Emsuda does not speak English. There was a translator on the phone with her, and the question was, would I come to Bosnia and help the Muslim women who had been ravaged by the Bosnian War and were refugees in this community? Would I come and help them heal and build peace and find a way to return to the homes, cities, and villages from which they had been expelled?
After the war, the Karuna Center worked in northern Bosnia for 6 years to rebuild shattered relations, first with women and then with educators. Vahidin Omanovic, a 27-year-old Bosnian Muslim teacher who participated in Karuna Center's workshops in Bosnia, remembers when the war came to his village.
I was 16 years old when the war broke out in my town of Sanski Most. We actually didn't have any idea what's gonna happen. My sisters came to our house and they were crying, and they told us that there are Serb soldiers everywhere and there are stories that they are killing people. So we decided in like 15 minutes that we will just escape from village and we will leave everything we had. It was 10 of us from my family. We escaped from the village and we actually ended up in a refugee camp in Slovenia. I returned to my village in 1996, and when I arrived, my house was destroyed and also other 700 houses were destroyed. I'm standing at the mass grave where we buried all people who were killed in 1992 in Hrustova. I think what is important is to say that all people who are buried here, they were killed by Serbs and they were killed as civilians. They weren't uniformed and they weren't armed. And there are about 300 people who were killed in Hrustova in 3 days in 1992. For me, it's very sad, and when I think about my best friend who is buried here also, she would be probably married now, she would be a happy person, and instead of having life like that, she was killed and she is in this mass grave. There is a bridge just outside the village of Hrustovo, and for us, for people from Hrustovo, that's the bridge of horror, because people who survived the third day, men and women were taken to that bridge, killed, or just pushed so they fall into the water, and then who would survive that falling to the water, they would kill them. Sana River is the biggest mass grave in our region. In June, July, and August in 1992, everybody could see dead bodies floating on the river.
Karuna Center's work in Bosnia began in 1997 in the city of Sanski Most, in response to a request to work with Bosnian Muslim women. These women had lost families and homes as a result of the ethnic cleansing of their cities and villages. Many had been expelled from Prijedor, which before the war had been a fully integrated, multi-ethnic city of about 100,000 people in northern Bosnia. Within 3 days in 1992, some 58,000 Bosnian Muslim citizens were forcibly removed from their homes. Most of the survivors eventually resettled in nearby Sanski Most, which became a predominantly Muslim town. As these Bosnian Muslim women came to know and trust Paula Green, they asked her to initiate contact with Serb women from Prijedor. The Karuna Center for Peacebuilding was the first organization to provide an opportunity for the women to speak with one another through a series of facilitated dialogues. Together, these Bosnian, Serb, and Muslim women made an emotional visit to Kozarac, a destroyed Muslim village near Prijedor. During this visit, Rosalia Hrustic, a Bosnian Muslim, saw for the first time since she was expelled the destroyed home that her family had lived in for generations. In 1998, the women in the dialogue groups suggested that Karuna Center focus its efforts on educators who would have a broad influence on restoring community relations and fostering a culture of tolerance while making schools safe places for the children of returning refugees. Out of this endeavor, Project DiaCom, the Project for Dialogue and Community in Bosnia, was born. The process of getting this project started was not easy.
I was working in an elementary school as a teacher of religious subject, and my principal, Ibro Seric, he asked me one day to come and participate in a seminar that was led by an American psychotherapist, Paula Green. And I said, okay, can you give me some information about it? And then he said, it's just for teachers and teachers from Sanski Most and Prijedor, which meant that these teachers from Prijedor were Serbs and teachers from Sanski Most were Bosniaks. And I really didn't like that idea.
The first meeting with the Serb teachers was not easy. We were still in a state of depression, which had to do with all the devastation from the war. All the suffering and hardships which we survived, we still carried deep within us.
I was very angry with Serbs and I hated them. And for me, even sit in a circle with Serbs was very hard.
The very first meeting of teachers took place in Sanski Most, and there was a tremendous amount of fear on the part of both groups of educators about how they would manage this, but they walked into the room, they shook hands with each other. Some of them had known each other before the war, and they began to talk to each other and to us with the help of translators about their experiences during the war and their hopes for the future.
Koji ima za temu budućnost DiaComa.
Senka Jakupovic, a Bosnian Muslim woman, became a refugee and teacher in Sanski Most after she and her family were expelled from Prijedor.
Kad sam se prvi put pozdravila sa svojim kolekcijom s kojom sam radila do rata u istoj školi.
It was very hard for me the first time I had to greet a colleague who I used to work with in the same school and socialized with until the war began. I was afraid of being too emotional, crying and showing my own vulnerability. That was how it began. I felt very uncomfortable in those first seminars.
Nekakvu nelagodu, nešto.
Radmila Bijelic is a Bosnian Serb teacher living in Prijedor. Though she and Senka had been close friends before the war, they did not see each other until the seminars of Project DiaCom reunited them 6 years later. Their first meetings together were extremely painful, as there was so much unspoken history separating them.
Senka je jedna od mojih prijatelja prije rata.
Senka is one of my friends from before the war who worked together with me in school. She knows me very well. My beliefs before and after the war remain the same. I'm a humanist at heart.
Humanista. Ono što me je vezalo za DiaCom.
I'm connected to Project DiaCom through my need to help. If in no other way, with a warm look, some kind of non-verbal communication, some kind of support. If nothing else, my presence at those meetings was my contribution toward beginning to change things.
Da čovjek se osjeti na neki način boljim.
In those initial meetings, certain impressions were made which broke through some prejudice so that we could all move forward.
Da se krene dalje.
The Bosnian Serb and Muslim educators engaged in carefully structured dialogues in which they shared the devastating impact of the war on themselves, their families, and communities. Gradually, with support from the group, participants were able to address their fears and grow more confident in their ability to engage with each other.
We place a lot of emphasis on dialogue in our work, and we often stress for people the difference between debate and dialogue, and that through dialogue we're trying to help people have a new conversation. We'll talk about what some of the old stuck conversations are, and they're frequently things like, who started the war? And they all know the same old stuck conversations that have gone around and around and bring no solution. So we talk about how through dialogue, through this process of deep, deep listening to the other person, to their experience, through the developing the capacity to really walk in the other person's shoes, that new understandings are developed and that new conversations occur. And very often that leads to new and creative solutions that nobody's thought of before. And very often the dialogue, it's a structured conversation. There's often ground rules that will really create an environment where real listening can happen. And people seem to appreciate that structure and find the safety to be able to speak really from their hearts and really out of their experience. And that changes the whole tone of the conversation.
Emsuda Mujagic, a Bosnian Muslim, was the founder of the Women's Dialogue Group.
The work with Paula is very important because she makes dialogue possible. Through dialogue, we arrive at answers to many questions. From the very beginning in 1997 until today, there has been a great shift in northwestern Bosnia, where Paula works.
Nuska Sivac, a Bosnian Muslim lawyer and judge from Prijedor, was imprisoned in a concentration camp during the war.
To treba biti put, da se mi svi suočimo sa vlastitom.
The way for us to face the past is through dialogue. That's crucial because we all carry some kind of scars, wounds, and traumas of our own. If this is not cleared up, there is no path forward into the future.
Svoje rane, svoje traume. nema puta u budućnost.
Dialogue is also a way to get to the truth, because in Bosnia there has been a great deal of manipulation of the truth. When the truth is known, the road to making peace will be an easier one. And that is the way to build the future.
In these situations where people are fed a lot of propaganda and a lot of rhetoric, they've become so distanced from the other, and they have so many projections about the other, and there's so many stereotypes and prejudices that their perception becomes really, really distorted. So it's remarkable to me how much can be achieved by just creating the safe conditions under which people can really build relationship, really get to know each other, really understand each other.
Milka Marinkovic is a Bosnian Serb educator who remained in Prijedor during the war. Milka was the first Serb member of Project DiaCom to express grief and shame about atrocities committed by Bosnian Serbs against their Muslim colleagues.
Sve ovo što smo radili u DiaComu, sve ovo.
All the work we did in Project DiaCom was about building peace, to ensure that war would not happen again.
Nam se ne ponovi rat. Mi stoljećima nismo učili.
For centuries, we have not been taught in our schools how to engage in dialogue and resolve conflicts in a peaceful way.
U našim školama mi se divimo junacima koji su.
We are in awe of heroes who resolve things with weapons. This is the way we are raised.
Vaspitani i zato je ova promjena.
That's why this change in education, in schools and in ourselves is very important.
Vrlo važna, ali je to vrlo.
This is a very challenging process and we can't do it alone.
Mi to sami ne možemo uraditi.
For me, actually, DiaCom was my personal healing. And in DiaCom, I met Serbs who actually made me sure that there are Serbs who are good and who are against the genocide that Serbs did on Bosnian people.
Project DiaCom brought together hundreds of teachers and school principals from Sanski Most and Prijedor for peace-building workshops, which lasted up to 5 days in length. Karuna Center director Paula Green and her associates traveled to Bosnia 3 times a year over the course of 6 years to lead these seminars. In the latter years of the project, the Karuna Center focused its efforts on a series of advanced trainings for participants who learned to develop and deliver their own peace-building workshops. Working in mixed teams in each other's schools, these teachers went on to establish the first organization in the region formed jointly by Bosnian Serbs and Muslims. Karuna Center's formal training of Project DiaCom participants came to a close with a final seminar held at a hotel in the seaside town of Neum.
The first part of the training was to give each of our group members an opportunity to demonstrate a peace-building project which they had been involved in. So each woman or man in turn had a chance to stand up and become the teacher or trainer and to lead the group through exercises that they had been doing with children, with teachers, with members of the community, and to talk about what they had done. And it was kind of a prideful moment for them to be able to show us and tell us what they had done.
Dakle, nismo se bavili onim ekstremno katastrofičnim problemima na kojima, ne, to.
And I also like that you went from talking about the role play itself to talking about How does this relate to your own experience in your own family and community? The second part of the training involved our giving them feedback on what we were watching them do and talking about the ways in which they were delivering their trainings and helping them improve their style. After all these many years, there was still pain between them. There were still things that people don't want to talk about, or one side wants to talk about and one doesn't. We had a very powerful incident where Nada, one of our Serb educators, who's actually quite good at this work, talked about the time that the Muslims left Prijedor. And the Muslims really were angry about that because they didn't leave, they were expelled. And using the word left instead of expelled made it seem as if they just decided to take a vacation rather than having expulsion, house demolition, concentration camps, and plunder haunt their days when they left Prijedor. So we were still in dialogue. Those kind of things were still happening.
Bosnia never had, and this is a statistic, a larger migration of people from one area to another than during this war.
Mi smo otišli da ne bi bili ubijeni.
We left so we wouldn't be killed. That's not leaving of my own free will. I was forced to leave.
Ja nisam otišao što sam htio.
When a small number of people are attacked, the resulting exodus becomes like a tidal wave. Believe me, I wouldn't have stayed either. That's what happened in Sanski Most and Prijedor. It was a great fear.
Zašto me dirnuo da sam emotivno reagovala, jer ja nisam otišla samovoljno.
I reacted so emotionally because I didn't leave on my own free will. I was chased out. It was even harder for me when my parents were forced out. They were pushed onto a bus at gunpoint, and their house was burned down. When I didn't want to go, they used explosives to chase me out.
All I can say is that I'm very sorry about everything that happened.
Neorganizovani kao običan narod. Kako sam se mogla organizovati da pomognem nekome? S kim?
We were disorganized. How could I have managed to help anyone? Now, after Project DiaCom, we have changed our way of thinking and have become much stronger. Maybe now we could think differently. God forbid if it should ever happen again.
During the second week of the seminar in Neum, the trainees worked in mixed pairs of Bosnian Muslims and Serbs, leading a new group of 12 teachers through various peace-building exercises interspersed with in-depth dialogue sessions about the difficult feelings they still carried from the war. The participants demonstrated the facilitation skills they had acquired by managing contentious and painful issues as they emerged.
To bio jedan od razloga, a ne neko njeno naglo preobraćanje.
By training participants to develop and facilitate their own peace-building workshops, and in turn to teach new facilitators, Karuna Center builds local leadership. In this way, the work becomes self-sustaining and its impact far-reaching.
Evo ja ću reći da smo mi realizirali jedan od tih projekata.
We had a peace-building project in our school. It was an extraordinary experience. There was so much camaraderie. Project DiaCom successfully brought the students closer together.
Vrlo uspješno zbližio učenike.
Ja sam se uvjerila.
The workshops we had with Paula Green convinced me that the process of dialogue helped us to restore communication among ourselves. I believe that dialogue can only change the situation in our country for the better. We won't be able to understand each other if we aren't able to sit and talk together at the same table and hear about each other's needs, wishes, and concerns.
Zato sam posebno ponosna I sretna.
I feel especially proud and fortunate to be part of Project DiaCom.
Što sam imala prilike da učim.
I had an opportunity to learn and work on myself in a serious way and become stronger.
Sobom I jačam.
They worked in mixed teams as Serbs and Muslims. They designed together. They delivered their trainings together. They danced and sang together in the evenings. One of the great joys was witnessing them sing Bosnian songs together that they used to sing when they were all part of Yugoslavia. And sometimes they would weep because the songs touched them so deeply and brought back the memories of what they had lost. We used the Bosnia work as a model. We learned so much from our Bosnian colleagues about what is required in the process of building peace after mass violence. And everything we've learned with the Bosnians we're using in Macedonia, Sri Lanka, Rwanda, the Middle East, and many other places that we work.
The Karuna Center has led both separate and joint seminars for Israelis and Palestinians. In dialogues between the two groups, trusting relationships developed despite the challenge of ongoing conflict. In the early 1990s, Karuna Center worked with Burmese refugees on the border between Thailand and Burma, teaching workshops in nonviolence and peacebuilding. Paula Green also led trips for international activists and journalists to report on the plight of the refugees. In 1995, Karuna Center was invited to teach nonviolent conflict resolution in the Mugunga refugee camp in the Congo, which held over 200,000 Hutus who had fled Rwanda after the 1994 genocide. When Paula returned to the camp a year later, she discovered that her work had inspired the founding of 17 centers for the study of nonviolence. The Karuna Center is currently leading seminars for Rwandan women's organizations working on reconciliation. In Macedonia, the Karuna Center is teaching conflict management skills and facilitating dialogues between Albanian and Macedonian educators. These educators are building mutual trust and developing joint projects that bring together children, parents, and teachers from both communities. The people of Sri Lanka suffered through 20 years of civil war until a ceasefire was signed in 2002. Having engaged in peacebuilding in Sri Lanka since 1995, the Karuna Center is currently working with community leaders from Sri Lanka's 3 major ethnic groups to implement projects in conflict transformation and reconciliation. In Dharamsala, India, the Karuna Center is partnering with the Tibetan Center for Conflict Resolution to address difficulties within the Tibetan refugee community and with their Indian neighbors. This partnership is bridging the language of conflict transformation with the traditions of Tibetan Buddhism. To meet the growing demand of its programs, the Karuna Center has expanded its team of trainers to include 12 international associates. Paula Green has also created the CONTACT program, Conflict Transformation Across Cultures, at the School for International Training in Brattleboro, Vermont, where she is a professor. The CONTACT Summer Peacebuilding Institute draws participants from around the world. Rich cross-cultural experiences form the backdrop for learning the essential skills of conflict resolution. Participants return to their home communities as part of a supportive global network seeking to create sustainable peace and justice throughout the world.
In the countries where we work, I think for most part, people have recognized that violence is not a solution to their problems because they've seen firsthand the total devastation of violence. And usually in these civil wars and these ethnic wars, there are no winners. There was no winner in the Bosnian War. There was no winner in 20 years of Sri Lankan civil war. So people are war weary. And they're really at a point of recognizing that violence offers no solutions. And I think they're really ready to explore nonviolent means of change. And our challenge as Karuna Center trainers is to give them the tools, to show them that there are other ways of resolving conflicts.
The Karuna Center believes that the practice of peace building belongs to every generation. Societies can rebuild trust in the aftermath of mass violence and slowly shift from hatred and mistrust to coexistence and cooperation. When beset with difficulties, local leaders rely on outside support as well as their own traditions to solve problems and reconcile relationships. Models developed in one region of the world can be adapted in other regions. The Karuna Center for Peacebuilding plays a small but significant role in this worldwide quest for justice and reconciliation. The path of peacebuilding is a never-ending creation, infused with the wisdom of many cultures and held together by compassion, commitment, and a vision of a truly interdependent global community.